You're listening to FemTalk 89 FM. I'm Alisia Evans here in Istanbul, Turkey, where it's the second and final day at the World Humanitarian Summit. And my guest today was one of 6 panelists at the Women and Girls side event, Australia's Ambassador for Women and Girls, Natasha Stott Despoja. Natasha, welcome back to 89 FM. Last time we spoke was during the 16 Days of Activism back in 2014, back in Suva. But today I'd like to talk to you about the past 2 days, or the events of the past 2 days. It started with the pre-summit event where women first responders presented a communique on their recommendations for what this summit should guarantee for women and girls in humanitarian situations. But you also saw the other side of the summit, where there is a shocking lack of women's participation outside of this gender sphere. So how do you then ensure that there is better accountability on gender equality throughout these international summits? I mean, you mentioned yesterday having this kind of summit pledge or even a quota on women's inclusion in government delegations. Kind of said in jest, but there is a serious need for something like this.
Yes. Well, first of all, I think that the fact that issues affecting women and girls are on the agenda, whether that's marginal in some people's eyes, whether it's central for others, it's a big step to get these issues on the agenda. Would I like to see them as central to all discussions? Absolutely. Do I want more women at the table as leaders, policymakers, women's accounts and experiences as first responders reflected and represented? Absolutely. And I don't think you can have a successful humanitarian summit or reformed humanitarian architecture without women being central to that process. So you're right, I said semi-in jest, a summit pledge in the same way that we have a panel pledge. You know, you don't go to a panel, you don't contribute or participate unless there's equal representation. I feel that strongly, and I actually think countries around the world could sign up to that. And some might, some won't. Some will see it as aspirational, some will be able to achieve it, and maybe we give them some kind of tick, some kind of accreditation that says you've made this effort. But we know that women and girls are central to this process, so why aren't they central to the summit?
Thank you. So this World Humanitarian Summit, obviously countries from across the world are here, but in the Pacific region, coming back home, has recently borne the brunt of a lot of natural disasters over the past couple of years. So when we talk about the resilience of communities, and particularly women, what stands out for you in the role of women as first responders and in leading community resilience?
Well, first of all, women are first responders. We know that women are out there keeping communities together, keeping their families together, and indeed keeping nations together. So women are doing the hard yards, and in many cases it may be a case of requiring assistance in additional resourcing, additional training, support, or money. So we know that women have these experiences, and we must be listening to these experiences. And as I said yesterday, not just consulting, but actually women sharing these experiences from positions of power and respect. So we can learn from those experiences, and we listen to what women tell us, particularly in our region. And I keep emphasising, you know, the beauty, the unique beauty of our region, but the fact that it is prone to disasters. The Pacific has had a disproportionate, it seems, number of natural disasters in recent times, whether you're talking in Fiji, whether you're talking Vanuatu in the last year. It's really critical that we learn from those experiences and the women who kept their communities together. And what did they tell us? Well, they weren't listened to. They weren't central to the response effort. Or, you know, a lot of men are either in situ, or humanitarian men come in and say, come on, move out the way, here are the experts. Whereas these women are experts in their communities. They need assistance and support on the ground. Their experiences also need to be reflected and represented in environments like this. And we know what they want. We know local responses, locally led responses, better resourcing, support for women's security, in fact a prioritisation of women's security, including dignity, including support with sexual and reproductive health, which is a massively important issue and doesn't necessarily get the attention it deserves, including at summits such as this. So we know what we've got to start doing, so let's do it.
Thank you. Again, looking at the Pacific region, you said it has this unique beauty, but there's also something unique about the Pacific, not so positive, that it has the lowest representation of women politicians globally.
Yes.
You yourself have quite an interest and experience in politics. Obviously you've been kind of tagged as the youngest female politician in Australia, but For you yourself, having been involved at different levels of politics, and looking at young women or women in general in the Pacific,
yes,
what is your kind of top tip or one message to women when it comes to being involved or engaged in politics?
A couple of things there. First of all, I do have the distinction of being the youngest woman to ever enter the federal parliament, but we know that's a long time ago, okay, 1995. So I'm a former senator, former politician, and I'm a great believer in more women being in decision-making institutions, including politics and parliament. And I think that a lot of my work and that of Australia's work in partnership with our Pacific brothers and sisters is about supporting women's participation in leadership roles. Very passionate about that. You're right, we have some of the lowest levels in the world, below 6% in terms of women's representation. In terms of young women, well, of course, this is an issue close to my heart, but I also see the work that you do, FemLink, civil society organisations, not just in Fiji, but across the Pacific. And that's where I derive so much inspiration, because I see the next generation of leaders. I see a current generation of leaders among women. You know, we keep talking about young people of the future. Young people of the now. They're actually leading these efforts. And, you know, to hear you and your colleagues talk about the critical role of information technology, to talk about media, social media, you know, you've got it. You're leading that debate. You're not followers. You're not, you know, there is not a generation ahead of you necessarily that's in that space, apart from maybe Sharon Bagwan-Rolls, who, of course, is an extraordinary civil society leader. So I think that the young people are there. We need to ask those young leaders what they need and want from us, so that they can support each other. When you ask what advice I give, it's the one piece of advice I give to women all over the world, in politics, in leadership, in whatever profession. You must have support networks. You must support each other. Sisters must support each other, because all of those professions, particularly male-dominated ones, particularly politics, they can be brutal, they can be lonely, they can be really hard places. And I know that there are difficulties for women in politics in Australia that are sometimes not the same difficulties that a woman in the Pacific, or say in Fiji or Tonga or Samoa or Vanuatu or Nauru may have. I get that. But there are some similarities that we all share. Some are compounded in different places and regions for a whole range of other issues. But we must support each other. So if you're looking to go into politics or parliament, or you're involved in civil society and grassroots activism or advocacy, again, support each other.
So obviously at the start of the interview I talked about the pre-summit with the communique, and you listened to some of the experiences, opportunities, but also barriers that women first responders experience on the ground. Your reflection of that, what did you think about it?
I'm so pleased that that was my entree to the summit, because I was in a room with passionate men and women who were champions for gender equality, for women and girls, and the empowerment of children and people who are often considered quite vulnerable. There was a recognition of the role of women, of young people, of people with disabilities. It was as it should be, you know, an environment in which people were heard, people's views counted, and it resulted in a communique that made perfect sense and set a wonderful agenda for how we should treat women, how we should deal with women's experiences as first responders, and it actually shaped the critical role that women played at this agenda. So I was a little shocked to attend an opening reception as part of the broader World Humanitarian Summit that night, where not only was there no female speaker on the stage, I was in a room of majority men, and indeed at the end they called up to the stage the board that was responsible for this event, hosting this event, and honestly there were 2 women, I think, and about 30, maybe more men. And I know that symbolism counts. I know that this might just be a reality check, you know, a reflection of how things are in terms of positions of power in Turkey and elsewhere, because it's not just Turkey, it's a global issue. But symbolism matters. Substance matters too. But unless you have women's faces, women's voices reflected and represented at these events, they will not work. It's the same with people with disabilities. You can't turn up to a disability session and round table and not have captions working, or the signing working, or other devices that ensure that people with disabilities are central to this discussion and debate. These things matter. They may seem peripheral to some leaders, but to me, they're bread and butter. And once we get those issues right, we can perhaps solve this humanitarian agenda little by little.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was Natasha Stott Despoja, Australian Ambassador for Women and Girls. I'm Alisia Evans. Stay tuned to FemTalk for more coverage and interviews during the first World Humanitarian Summit in Turkey.